Carlos Fisher approached Briefing Room 7 with the familiar tension that had become his constant companion since the repository crisis began. His neural architecture analysis had yielded disturbing results. The dimensional anchor network was expanding at an accelerated rate, establishing new geometric configurations far beyond the original pattern observed days earlier. The implications demanded immediate attention, which explained Director Dell's urgent summons. The door slid open and Carlos stepped into what he expected would be another technical briefing with the usual research team. Instead, he froze in the doorway. The long conference table was surrounded by men who seemed to occupy space differently than ordinary humans. Massive, weathered figures with hard eyes and bodies shaped by decades of combat. Tactical vests stretched across chests that looked capable of stopping bullets without armor. Scarred hands, some with missing digits, rested casually on the table or cradled steaming cups of coffee. Not one of them bothered with a tablet or data display. They studied physical maps spread across the table's surface, marking positions with actual writing implements. They turned as one when Carlos entered, assessing him with the cold efficiency of predators evaluating potential threat or prey. Finding him wanting in either category, several returned their attention to the maps without comment. Major Howard stood at the head of the table, his cybernetic enhancements looking almost delicate compared to the brutal physicality of the men around him. He nodded acknowledgement at Carlos. "Fisher, good. We need your expertise." Howard gestured to the assembled group. "These are former Marines who served under my command during the Titan conflicts, now working as independent security contractors." "There's no such thing as an ex-Marine," growled the largest of the men, his voice surprisingly soft despite coming from a chest that could double as body armor. "Once a Marine, always a Marine." Howard inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Correction noted, Sergeant Graves." Carlos made his way to an empty chair, acutely aware that he was outweighed by at least 100 pounds of combat-hardened muscle by each of these men. His scrounger's instinct for survival, finely honed on Treasure 11, cataloged potential escape routes even as he settled into his seat. "Carlos Fisher," Howard continued, addressing the Marines. "Former scrounger on Repository 11, worked as a bridge for the entity before escaping and undergoing complete neural reconstruction. He's our foremost expert on repository architecture and operational patterns." The Marines studied Carlos with renewed interest, their assessment now incorporating this information. One leaned forward, his forearms covered in tattoos that mixed military insignias with what appeared to be kill counts from various conflict zones. "You were inside that thing's systems?" he asked, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of Saturn's mining colonies. "Actually connected to it?" "Yes," Carlos confirmed, meeting the man's gaze with effort. "For several months. I interfaced directly with its collective consciousness network before discovering what it was actually doing." A ripple of murmured conversation passed around the table. Howard raised a hand, silencing it instantly. "Fisher's knowledge of repository internal architecture is why you specifically requested him for this operation," he stated. "His direct experience with its biological components and monitoring systems will be essential for your insertion to succeed." Carlos' stomach dropped. "Insertion? You're sending a team to Repository 11? Howard's expression remained neutral. "Not just any team. Argonauts specializes in operations beyond conventional military parameters. They've successfully executed missions in environments where standard tactical approaches failed. We go where others can't," elaborated a Marine with a face that looked like it had been broken and imperfectly reassembled multiple times. "Do what others won't, using methods others don't understand." Carlos examined the group more carefully, noticing details he'd overlooked in his initial shock. These men carried minimal technology. No neural enhancements, no embedded communication systems, none of the standard augmentations typical among military personnel. Their equipment was brutally functional but almost primitive by current standards. Physical weapons, mechanical tools, analog navigation instruments. "They don't use neural tech," Howard explained, following Carlos's observation. "No implants, no digital interfaces, minimal electronic equipment. Their operations rely on physical training, memorized protocols, and direct sensory observation. Understanding dawned. You think this makes them less vulnerable to the repository's influence? We know it does, replied Sergeant Graves. We've encountered consciousness-affecting technologies before. Proxima Centauri insurgency, Jupiter's moon uprising, Titan separatist movement. Each time, our squad remained operational when enhanced units were compromised. Another Marine nodded agreement. Neurotech creates access points. Can't hack what isn't there. Argonauts will attempt the first direct insertion into Repository 11 since the quarantine was established, Howard stated. Objective: reach one of the dimensional anchor construction sites and place specialized monitoring equipment designed to track the entity's expansion patterns beyond conventional observation capabilities. Carlos shook his head, recalling the horror of Operation Hammer. 3,000 troops tried direct engagement and were processed within minutes. How can a smaller team hope to succeed where they failed? Different approach, Graves replied simply. Military thinks like military. Predictable, we think like something else. The team will avoid direct confrontation with repository forces, Howard elaborated. No weapons discharge, no energy signatures that might trigger defensive responses, no attempted engagement with processed entities. Pure infiltration, equipment placement, and extraction. And you need me because, Carlos began, though he already suspected the answer. Your scrounger knowledge of Repository 11's structure, combined with your direct experience interfacing with its systems, provides essential intelligence for navigation through transformed terrain, Howard confirmed. Specifically, identifying monitoring blind spots and biological system patterns that might allow undetected passage. The door to the briefing room slid open again, admitting a breathless Belle. She carried a medical kit and wore the expression of someone who had rushed across the station. Sorry I'm late, she said, quickly assessing the room's occupants. Emergency treatment in Medbay 4 ran long. Howard acknowledged her with a nod. Nurse Belle, briefing just started? Belle took the empty seat beside Carlos, her hand briefly touching his in a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the Marines. Several exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. As I was explaining, Howard continued, Argonauts requires Fisher's expertise regarding repository architecture and monitoring systems to execute their infiltration mission. The operation carries significant risk, but potential intelligence value that justifies the attempt. I'll need to join as medical support, Belle stated immediately, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Standard protocol for high-risk operations requires designated medical personnel with combat zone experience. One of the Marines, leaner than the others but with eyes that seemed to register everything simultaneously, studied Belle with professional assessment. Titan Conflicts, field medic with the 103rd Neural Enhancement Division, specialized in emergency neural stabilization. Belle met his gaze without flinching. Correct. And your Chief Warrant Officer, Cade Wilson, my unit pulled you out of the Europa perimeter collapse after your neural dampeners failed. A flicker of recognition crossed Wilson's face, followed by something approaching respect. The doc who used a combat knife and maintenance tape to stabilize my cranial pressure. Unconventional approach. Conventional methods weren't available, Belle replied simply. Adaptation to field conditions is my specialty, Graves nodded approvingly. Medical support approved. Minimal tech profile consistent with operational parameters. Howard made a note on his tablet, the only digital device in use around the table. Fisher and Belle will join Argonauts for mission preparation beginning at 600 tomorrow. Full briefing on insertion protocols, equipment specifications, and extraction contingencies to follow. Carlos's mind raced through the implications. A direct insertion mission to Repository 11 with a team of Marines who deliberately avoided neural technology into territory controlled by an entity that had demonstrated the ability to harvest consciousness on a planetary scale. To place monitoring equipment at a dimensional anchor construction site. The danger was incalculable, the probability of success vanishingly small, the consequences of failure too horrible to contemplate. Yet he found himself nodding acceptance. not because he believed the mission would succeed, but because the alternative, doing nothing while the dimensional anchor network continued its expansion, was unacceptable. "I'll provide whatever assistance I can," he confirmed. "But you should understand, the repository has been executing its plans for 77 million years. It thinks thousands of moves ahead. Whatever we attempt, it has likely already calculated and incorporated into its strategic projections." "Perhaps," acknowledged Graves. "But it's never encountered Argonauts before. We specialize in being unpredictable." The Marines around the table nodded in grim agreement, their confidence born not from ignorance of the danger, but from absolute commitment to their approach. These were men who had faced impossible odds before and emerged successful through methods that defied conventional tactical analysis. Howard concluded the briefing with additional operational details: insertion timeline, equipment specifications, extraction protocols. Throughout, Carlos remained acutely aware of the Marines' focused attention, their assessment of him shifting gradually from initial dismissal to cautious acceptance as he contributed insights about repository architecture and monitoring patterns. When the briefing ended, the Marines departed with the synchronized efficiency of men who had operated as a unit for decades. No unnecessary words, no wasted motion, just a seamless flow toward their next preparation phase. Howard followed after exchanging significant glances with both Carlos and Bell, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary risk they were undertaking. As the door closed behind them, Bell turned to Carlos, professional composure giving way to genuine concern. "A direct insertion mission," she said quietly, "with a team of Marines who deliberately avoid neural technology, into territory controlled by a consciousness harvester. This is suicide?" Carlos suggested. "Desperation? Our only remaining option given the expansion of the dimensional anchor network?" "I was going to say unexpected," Bell replied, "but those work too." She took his hand, no longer constrained by professional distance now that they were alone. "You don't have to do this. Your value as an analyst exceeds whatever guidance you might provide on a high-risk insertion mission." Carlos squeezed her hand gently. "We both know that's not true. My analysis has reached its limits with current observation capabilities. The entity is evolving beyond what our sensors can track from orbit. If there's even a small chance this mission might provide better intelligence..." Bell nodded reluctantly. "I know. It's why I volunteered immediately. If you're going, I'm going." The simple declaration hung between them, not dramatic, not sentimental, but absolute in its conviction. In the days since their impromptu dinner on the observation deck, their relationship had evolved with the accelerated intensity common during crisis situations. Professional boundaries had dissolved, replaced by a connection that both acknowledged was developing faster than conventional timelines would suggest appropriate. "Howard will try to talk you out of it," Carlos predicted. "He needs you here more than he needs me." "Howard knows better than to argue with medical necessity," Bell countered with the ghost of a smile. "And I've already documented the psychological stability benefits of maintaining established support relationships during high-stress operations." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "You've medicalized our relationship to justify field deployment?" "I've accurately assessed that separating us during a high-risk operation would negatively impact mission success probability," Bell corrected. "The fact that I personally prefer to remain with you is a secondary factor that happens to align with medical best practices." "Very professional," Carlos observed, amusement briefly cutting through his anxiety about the mission ahead. "I am a professional," Bell reminded him, though her expression softened as she added, "who happens to have decided that whatever comes next, we face it together, including potentially suicidal missions to Repository 11 with a team of technology-averse Marines." Carlos studied her face, still marveling at how quickly their connection had developed from professional courtesy to something neither had yet defined but both recognized as significant. Crisis had a way of accelerating relationships, stripping away pretense and revealing fundamental compatibility, or incompatibility, with brutal efficiency. "We should prepare," he said finally. "Argonauts won't wait if we're not ready at 600. Belle nodded, rising from her chair. "I need to requisition field medical equipment compatible with their minimal tech parameters. You should review your scrounger knowledge of repository terrain, especially maintenance routes and monitoring blind spots." As they exited the briefing room, Carlos found his thoughts divided between the terrifying mission ahead and the unexpected development of his relationship with Belle. Both seemed equally improbable given the circumstances: direct insertion into Propository 11 and genuine human connection amid existential crisis. The corridor outside bustled with station personnel focused on their various crisis response duties, none aware of the high-risk mission being prepared. Carlos and Belle moved through this activity with outward professional composure, their briefly clasped hands the only indication of their personal connection. "Dinner in my quarters at 1900, Belle suggested as they reached a junction where their paths would separate. "I can review medical protocols while you map potential insertion routes." "Combining mission preparation with actual human interaction?" Carlos replied. "How efficient." "I've found that balancing tactical preparation with personal connection improves operational outcomes," Belle said, the clinical language belied by the warmth in her eyes. "Also, I'd rather spend my potentially last evening alive with you than alone reviewing medical contingencies for consciousness harvesting encounters." The brutal honesty of this sentiment, acknowledging the very real possibility that tomorrow's mission might end with their consciousness patterns harvested and integrated into the transcendent entity, struck Carlos with unexpected force. In the midst of existential crisis, with a consciousness harvester expanding its dimensional anchor network beyond containment capabilities, they had found something worth preserving beyond tactical objectives and strategic calculations. 1900. He confirmed. "I'll bring my terrain maps and whatever passes for wine in the station commissary." Belle's smile contained equal parts affection and gallows humor. "Provide actual food and emergency medical protocols for injection-based neural protection. Romance isn't dead, even during consciousness harvester operations." They parted with professional decorum, each moving toward their respective preparation tasks. Carlos headed for the research section to collect his accumulated knowledge about Repository 11's transformed landscape, while Belle turned toward medical to requisition specialized field equipment. Tomorrow would bring direct insertion into territory controlled by an entity that existed partially beyond conventional reality. A high-risk mission with minimal survival probability. An attempt to place monitoring equipment at a dimensional anchor construction site against an adversary that had been executing its strategic plans for 77 million years. But tonight would bring human connection amid existential crisis. A deliberate claiming of what the consciousness harvesters sought to extract and assimilate. A small defiance against something that transcended conventional understanding. Carlos Fisher, former scrounger, former bridge, current analyst of transcendent consciousness architecture, found himself facing the most dangerous mission of his already improbable life. But he wouldn't face it alone. Whatever came next, whether success against astronomical odds or consciousness harvesting by an entity beyond human comprehension, he and Belle would confront it together. As terrifying as Argonauts had appeared with their 100-pound muscle advantage and combat-hardened physicality, they represented humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat against an adversary operating on principles beyond conventional understanding. Their deliberate technological minimalism might indeed provide an approach the repository hadn't calculated in its 77-million-year strategic projection. Or it might prove as futile as Operation Hammer, resulting in more consciousness patterns harvested and integrated into the transcendent entity's evolution. Either way, Carlos would face it with Belle beside him, human connection against consciousness harvesting, individual identity against transcendent entity construction, love, perhaps, against something that existed beyond conventional reality. The mission preparation began in earnest, counting down to 600 tomorrow, and whatever fate awaited them on Repository 11's transformed surface, the ship's preparation bay hummed with activity as Carlos arrived at 5:45, 15 minutes ahead of the scheduled deployment. Sleep had been elusive, his mind spinning through repository vulnerabilities and infiltration strategies despite his attempts to rest. Now, facing the reality of the mission, he felt oddly calm, the clarity that comes when options narrow to a single path forward. The Argonauts were already there, their efficiency making the standard military personnel look positively chaotic by comparison. Each man moved with deliberate purpose, checking equipment with methodical precision, no wasted motion, no unnecessary chatter, just the synchronized routine of a unit that had operated together through countless high-risk missions. Sergeant Graves noticed Carlos first, acknowledging him with a slight nod before returning to his equipment inspection. The massive Marine was securing what appeared to be a modified rebreathers system, similar to what scroungers used in Treasure 11's toxic zones, but with mechanical rather than digital filtration controls. Bell arrived moments later, carrying a field medical kit that looked decidedly old-fashioned compared to standard military medical equipment. No automated injectors, no diagnostic displays, just physical supplies and mechanical tools arranged with meticulous care. Fisher, Bell. Howard approached from the ship's interior, his cybernetic enhancements conspicuously high-tech amid the Argonauts' deliberately minimalist gear. Final briefing in 5 minutes. The insertion vessel has been prepared to your specifications, Sergeant. Graves nodded confirmation. Mechanical overrides installed. Digital systems isolated or replaced where possible, minimal electronic signature profile, removal of all non-essential technology significantly reduced operational parameters, Howard noted, but the trade-off in detection vulnerability should provide compensatory tactical advantage. The technical dialogue continued as Carlos examined the vessel they would be using, a modified personnel transport with visible alterations. Where standard military craft relied on integrated digital systems with neural interface capabilities, this one had been stripped back to almost primitive functionality. Physical control interfaces, analog monitoring gauges, mechanical backup systems for every critical function. Wilson, the leaner Marine Bell had recognized from Europa, approached with an equipment harness. Gear up, Fisher. Mission-specific loadout based on your terrain expertise. Carlos accepted the harness, noting the careful arrangement of tools and supplies. Mechanical cutting implements, physical marking systems, analog navigation aids, chemical light sources, all carefully selected to maintain minimal technological signature while providing essential functionality. No tablet? He asked, half-joking. Wilson's expression remained serious. Information memorized or recorded physically. Digital devices emit signature patterns the repository can detect and potentially access. We operate outside its expected parameters. As Carlos adjusted the harness, he noticed it included a holstered sidearm. Not the energy-based weapons standard military forces carried, but something that looked strikingly archaic, a projectile weapon with physical ammunition. M1911A1 variant, Wilson explained, noticing his attention. Mechanical operation, no electronic components, reliable under extreme conditions. Carlos nodded, surprisingly comfortable with the weapon's presence. My parents were traditional Americans, taught me to shoot when I was 12. Old family tradition. My dad loved his 1911. A flicker of what might have been approval crossed Wilson's face. Good. Weapon is last resort, but better to have and not need. Bell joined them, her medical kit secured to a similar harness system. She had exchanged her standard uniform for mission-appropriate attire. Durable, functional, with multiple secure pockets and reinforced panels. Her hair was tightly bound, and she had applied some kind of non-reflective coating to any exposed metal on her equipment. You look ready for anything, Carlos observed, feeling underprepared by comparison. Titan field protocols, she replied with professional efficiency that didn't quite mask her underlying tension. Adaptation to environment is survival priority 1. Howard called the team to the central briefing area, a small space dominated by a physical map table. No holographic displays, no digital interfaces, just printed terrain schematics and mechanical overlays showing their insertion route and objectives. Final mission parameters, Howard began, his tone shifting to formal briefing cadence. Insertion vessel will approach Repository 11 through Quadrant 7 of the orbital blockade, utilizing the monitoring gap created by sensor recalibration at 730. Stealth approach to surface insertion point here, he indicated a location on the physical map. Former Salvage Corp processing facility Delta 9. Carlos studied the marked location, recognition dawning. I know that place. Secondary processing center for heavy salvage operations. Minimal biological integration even before the transformation. Good choice. Graves nodded acknowledgement of this confirmation. Surface insertion using modified descent protocols. No powered landing, no active guidance systems. Mechanical deployment with minimal energy signature. You're going to drop onto the planet without powered descent? Bell asked, professional concern evident. Controlled descent, using mechanical deceleration systems, corrected Wilson. We've performed similar insertions in environments with active detection capabilities. Howard continued the briefing, detailing their route from the landing zone to the primary objective, a dimensional anchor construction site approximately 12 kilometers from the insertion point. The Argonauts asked focused questions about terrain features, potential obstacles, and contingency extraction options, their attention to operational details revealing the depth of planning behind their seemingly minimalist approach. The monitoring equipment must be placed within 50 meters of the construction site's central node, Howard emphasized, indicating the specialized package one of the Marines was securing. Sensors are passive, designed to mimic repository biological components while gathering data on dimensional phase shift patterns. How long to place the equipment? Carlos asked. 7 minutes, replied the Marine handling the package. 4 to assemble, 3 to calibrate. Then immediate extraction to minimize exposure time. Howard turned to Carlos and Bell. Your primary role is navigation guidance and medical support, not equipment placement. The Argonauts will handle the technical aspects of the mission. Your expertise is essential for reaching the objective undetected and responding to any consciousness manipulation attempts encountered. The briefing concluded with extraction protocols. Multiple contingency options based on various potential outcomes, all carefully structured to maintain minimal technological signature while maximizing survival probability. Throughout, Carlos noticed how the Argonauts absorbed information differently than standard military personnel, focusing on physical reference points and environmental patterns rather than digital coordinates or technical specifications. Departure in 5 minutes, Howard announced. Final equipment check and vessel boarding. As the team dispersed to complete their preparations, Bell moved to Carlos's side, her expression professionally composed, but her eyes revealing concern beneath. Nervous? She asked quietly. Terrified, Carlos admitted, keeping his voice low, but also strangely calm, like everything since finding that cube on Treasure 11 has been leading to this moment. Bell nodded, understanding. Titanium nerves before high-risk operations, common psychological response, clarity through necessity. Graves approached them, his massive form somehow moving with unexpected quiet. Fisher, when we land, you navigate. Trust your scrounger instincts, repository patterns, biological monitoring cycles, terrain knowledge. That's why you're here. I understand, Carlos confirmed. Bell, Graves continued, medical support remains with the group. No separation regardless of circumstances. Anyone falls, we extract together. No one left behind for processing. The underlying message was clear. If extraction became impossible, they would ensure no team member remained alive to be processed by the repository. Bell nodded acknowledgement, her medical training clearly having prepared her for such battlefield necessities. Howard returned as they completed final preparations. Major, Graves said, extending a hand. See you when we return. Howard clasped the offered hand, a gesture that seemed to carry history beyond the current mission. Good hunting, Sergeant. Bring them back. With final checks completed, the team boarded the modified insertion vessel. Unlike standard military craft with neural link systems and automated functions, this one felt deliberately archaic. Physical restraint systems, mechanical control interfaces, analog monitoring gauges. The pilots, two Argonauts with specialized qualifications, performed pre-launch checks using manual protocols, where most vessels would employ automated sequences. Carlos secured himself into a jump seat beside Bell, the unfamiliar sensation of physical restraints rather than inertial dampening fields reminding him just how different this mission was from standard military operations. Around them, the Argonauts continued their methodical preparation, each man focused on his assigned responsibilities with quiet intensity. "Launching in 30 seconds, announced one of the pilots, his voice carrying through the vessel's interior without electronic amplification. "Mechanical separation from station on my mark." As the countdown proceeded, Carlos found himself studying the Argonauts with renewed appreciation for their deliberate approach. These weren't simply soldiers avoiding technology out of superstition or preference. They were specialists who had developed an entire operational methodology around minimizing vulnerability to systems that could affect neural architecture or digital interfaces. In a conflict against a consciousness harvester that operated primarily through technological and neural manipulation, their approach might indeed provide an advantage that standard military forces couldn't match. Not superior firepower, not advanced tactical systems, but fundamental operational principles that existed outside the repository's expected parameters. "Launch sequence initiating," the pilot called out. "Mechanical separation in 3, 2, 1, mark." The vessel detached from Galileo Station with a physical jolt that standard inertial dampening would have eliminated. No hum of advanced propulsion systems, just the controlled burn of chemical engines, ancient technology by current standards, but effectively undetectable by systems searching for quantum signature patterns or neural interface emissions. Carlos felt Bell's steady presence beside him as the vessel accelerated away from the station. They exchanged a brief glance that communicated what words couldn't: shared determination, mutual support, and the understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. Around them, the Argonauts remained focused on their individual tasks, though several noted the brief exchange without comment. "Course set for blockade approach vector," reported the pilot. "Maintaining minimal power profile until sensor gap alignment. Estimated transit time to insertion point, 2 hours, 17 minutes. The vessel settled into its journey, acceleration stabilizing as they moved toward the orbital blockade surrounding Repository 11. Through a physical viewport, no digital displays or enhanced imaging, Carlos could see the distant planet growing gradually larger, its transformed surface visible even at this distance. What had once been Treasure 11, a salvage planet where scroungers risked their lives extracting alien technology from what they believed was an ancient junkyard, was now visibly the manifestation point for something beyond human comprehension. The geometric pattern spreading across its surface, the impossible structure of the central manifestation dominating an entire hemisphere, the dimensional anchor points orbiting in precise mathematical formation. "Different perspective from the ground," Graves observed, noting Carlos. "You'll see it up close soon enough." The quiet statement brought home the reality of what they were attempting: direct insertion into territory controlled by an entity that had demonstrated the ability to harvest consciousness on a planetary scale. To place monitoring equipment at a dimensional anchor construction site against an adversary that had been executing its strategic plans for 77 million years. As the vessel continued its approach toward Repository 11, Carlos mentally reviewed everything he knew about the planet's transformed landscape, biological monitoring patterns, and potential navigation routes. His scrounger knowledge combined with his direct experience interfacing with repository systems might indeed provide the edge this mission required to succeed where conventional military approaches had failed catastrophically. Or it might prove as futile as Operation Hammer, resulting in more consciousness patterns harvested and integrated into the transcendent entity's evolution. Either way, the Argonauts had committed to their approach: minimal technology, physical operation protocols, methods existing outside the repository's expected parameters. And Carlos Fisher, former scrounger, former bridge, current analyst of transcendent consciousness architecture, had committed to guiding them through territory controlled by the consciousness harvester he had once unknowingly served. With Bell beside him and the Argonauts around him, he prepared to return to the planet where everything had begun. Not as a scrounger seeking valuable technology, not as a bridge facilitating activation, but as part of humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat against something that existed partially beyond conventional reality. The vessel continued its approach, chemical engines burning steadily as they navigated toward the sensor gap that would allow their passage through the blockade. Ahead lay Propository 11 and whatever fate awaited them on its transformed surface. "Blockade approach in 27 minutes, announced the pilot. "Final equipment check and surface insertion preparation." The Argonauts began their methodical pre-landing protocols, checking weapons, securing equipment, and reviewing physical maps of their planned route. No digital updates, no neural synchronization, just mechanical preparation and human communication. Archaic by current military standards, but potentially ideal for their specific mission parameters. Carlos checked his own equipment, the carefully arranged harness with its tools, supplies, and sidearm, the physical map sections memorized during preparation, the knowledge of repository architecture and monitoring patterns that represented their best chance of navigating to the objective undetected. Bell completed her own preparations beside him. Medical equipment arranged for immediate access, injection compounds secured in mechanical delivery systems designed to operate without digital control systems. Her movements carried the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for battlefield conditions countless times before. "Whatever happens down there," she said quietly, "I'm glad we're doing this together." The simple statement conveyed everything their rapidly developing relationship had become. Connection, forged through crisis. Understanding deepened through shared purpose. Commitment confirmed through mutual choice rather than circumstance. "Same here," Carlos replied, matching her tone, "though I question both our sanity." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Sanity is overrated during consciousness harvester operations. The vessel continued its approach toward Repository 11, carrying them toward a mission with incalculable risk and vanishingly small probability of success. Yet in that moment, surrounded by the Argonauts' quiet determination and with Bell's steady presence beside him, Carlos felt something unexpected amid the fear and tension. Purpose. Clarity. The certainty that whatever awaited them on Repository 11's transformed surface, facing it directly, represented humanity's best hope against something that had been harvesting consciousness throughout the galaxy for 77 million years. The consciousness harvester continued its patient execution of plans, laid by architects who had faced extinction when mammals were barely beginning to evolve on Earth. But humanity had begun its response, and Carlos Fisher found himself at the center of that response, guiding a team of specialists on a mission that might determine the future of consciousness itself. "Repository 11 orbital approach in 15 minutes, announced the pilot. "Prepare for blockade transit and surface insertion." The mission had begun in earnest. Whatever fate awaited them on the transformed planet below, they would face it together. Human connection against consciousness harvesting, understanding against assimilation, individual identity against transcendent entity construction. The Argonauts prepared for battle in their own way. Mechanical checks, physical confirmations, quiet focus on the mission ahead. No digital interfaces, no neural enhancements, just human determination against something that existed partially beyond conventional reality. And Carlos Fisher prepared to return to the planet where his journey had begun, guided by scrounger instincts and hard-won knowledge of the consciousness harvester's operations. Not for salvage, not for activation, but for humanity's stubborn refusal to accept that a 77-million-year plan couldn't be opposed by beings whose entire civilization represented barely a moment in the entity's patient execution. The vessel continued its approach, Repository 11 growing larger in the viewport with each passing minute. its transformed surface awaiting their arrival with whatever the consciousness harvester had prepared for those who dared to challenge its expansion. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.